For this edition of Now Age Conversations, I'm speaking with Joshua Frank, the managing editor at Counterpunch. Hey, Joshua.
How's it going, Greg? Nice to be here.
Thanks for being here. Josh is also an award-winning environmental journalist and the author of Left Out: How Liberals Helped Re-elect George W. Bush. Could you imagine? I kind of like to say, I guess we talked about a little bit before, propaganda and the fake left media. Last week I spoke with John Stauber, who really is on to this, and he's been on to propaganda for decades. I've known John for a while, and really getting into, in this particular election cycle, how thick and how complete and how insidious it really is. And it's important, as we look back now, we see since the Clintons left the White House, they've been nothing but intent on getting back into the White House. And the question is that good for democracy? Is that a democracy? Is that good for anybody but the Clintons and the people that they represent?
Right.
Which is kind of the lead-in for this, and then what I seem to call the fake left media seems to be providing cover for Hillary. It's, in other words, how can we cover the vagaries of Donald Trump at every turn? What did he say today, and what did he say tomorrow, and what did he say yesterday? And of course, what gets avoided there is any kind of coverage of Hillary Clinton and the fact that she hasn't faced the media since December, and with a press conference, which is absolutely shocking. It should be shocking to anybody. But people don't seem to notice, and it's exactly the propaganda that seems to allow that dynamic. So, first, if you can talk a little bit about what Counterpunch is and how you got involved with the publication.
Yeah, sure. I've actually been writing for Counterpunch since maybe 2001 or so, and I got to know Jeffrey St. Clair at that time pretty well. I was living in Portland, and it was sort of hot off the heels of the anti-WTO protest in Seattle, which he and Alex did a great book on, 5 Days That Shook the World. And we were kind of in the same network of folks, and I've been an investigative journalist since then, did do some schooling and other things along the way. But then Jeff and I did have the opportunity to edit a couple books together. And when Alex Coburn passed away in 2012, Jeff asked me to come on board and help out and with Counterpunch in more ways. So I've been on board since then. Counterpunch has been around, though, since the mid-'90s. Ken Silverstein, who I'm sure you know and many people do, a DC investigative journalist, started the publication, brought Alex on. A couple years later, I think Ken left, and then Jeff and Alex edited the website and magazine, a print magazine. At that time, it was a newsletter up until Alex's death, and that's when I came on. So Counterpunch is, I think it's pretty safe to say, the largest left-leaning or left-wing publication in English in the world. We have a huge readership globally, and more so than any other English language publication. So and we're growing by the minute, which is great.
Yep. Now I bookmark, Counterpunch, years back, and I go there Monday through Friday. I know there's going to be fresh content and articles, and usually by writers and voices that you're just not going to find in other places. Right. In fact, today's lead piece by Diana Johnson, who's been writing. In fact, you could talk a little bit about her, but there's one quote that kind of pops out in her piece today, which is titled, what is it titled? Oh, it's about Hillary and the glass ceiling's illusion. And when she writes, in reality, hasn't the glass ceiling preventing women from pursuing successful careers already been shattered precisely by the current neoliberal world order, which favors promoting women and token members of various ethnic groups? Now, that's a strong statement, but it really gets to the core of, sort of what how insidious the structure of neoliberalism is, where you can have these politically correct appointments, people coming up, it all looks great from the outside, the right genders, the right colors being represented. But, can you talk a little bit more about why you chose to kind of lead with that piece today and who she is and what she's getting at?
Well, Diana's a fantastic writer and journalist, and she actually wrote a great book that we published called Queen of Chaos, which really goes into depth of Hillary's tenure as Secretary of State, and then, of course, her insidious rise to power, and where she is now, and how she essentially represents the neoliberal agenda. And I think what she's writing about in today's article is right on. I mean, we're looking at a system that's promoted Hillary, not necessarily a movement like feminism, right? And how much different would it be, let's say, than having Condoleezza Rice be the nominee? Would we be hearing the same, rhetoric coming from those that believe this is empowering women? When you, of course, look at Hillary's foreign policy, you realize it does actually the complete opposite. Whether it's subverting democratic rights in the Middle East or bombing children through drone strikes and all these things that she supports that will be carryovers from the Obama administration. So it's a lot to grasp, but someone like Diana she's really done a great job of breaking it down. And I definitely recommend her book, Queen of Chaos, to anybody that's interested.
Yeah, and similarly, while the election of Barack Obama was great as a social statement, what has it done for the situation for blacks in America?
Right.
Probably not all that much. And
Sure.
then, economically, if the rich have gotten richer and everybody else has kind of, gotten poorer, I mean, that, it's really where the economics turn out. Is how it affects people's lives, and things have not gotten better for blacks. And when I think about people say, oh, it would be great to have a woman. First of all, I think, okay, great to have Jill Stein. She's also a woman, but
Right.
that gets marginalized. But I mean, I think about Margaret Thatcher. Well, she was a woman,
Right.
and how'd that work out? So just the notion of the fact that we have the right gender in there does not guarantee us anything.
No, not at all. And I mean, I think we really need to look at her policies and her history and who supports her and what she supports to make that kind of decision. But it's very quick to be labeled something, right, if you are critical of Hillary. And I think that's what you're getting at as well, is that it's easy to criticize Donald Trump. I mean, he does it for himself, and it takes a little bit more guts to stick your neck out and criticize Hillary's policies and her agenda. But that's the election we're in right now, and Counterpunch is a place where you can go to get both.
Right. Well, as far as, talking about propaganda, I mean, Hillary started this sort of line, the vast right-wing conspiracy, back in the early 90s. And that now sticks. Any time that anybody has any criticism, legitimate, otherwise, whatever, we all get lumped in as you must be part of a vast right-wing conspiracy against her.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and as I get into a little bit later on, we see, how people are using that now to marginalize Jill Stein and to smear Jill Stein in a way that if you're voting for her, you must be voting for Trump, which, I don't know how the physics of that actually works.
Yeah. I think that really dates back to 2000, right? And the Nader campaign with the Greens, and how what the aftermath of that, and we can talk about that a bit, has led to this false fear that Jill Stein could somehow tilt the election. But of course, if you go back to the Nader campaign in 2000, that's not what happened, despite what someone like Eric Alterman might argue.
Right.
People really forget really fast how Al Gore picked Joe Lieberman, perhaps the most right-wing conservative Democrat in the Senate, to be his running mate. He lost his home state. More Democrats voted for Bush in Florida. I mean, we can go on and on.
Sure.
Ralph Nader was an easy scapegoat, right? Instead of the Democrats looking in the mirror and saying, this is why we ran a failed campaign. We did not actually, we took progressive voters for granted, and that's what they're doing now. And they'd rather demonize Jill Stein, right, or the Green Party, than say, no, actually, this is why you should vote for Hillary Clinton. It's not a vote against Donald Trump. It's a vote for something progressive. And I think that's where, we're in an interesting time, given the Sanders campaign and a lot of the folks that supported Sanders now being disillusioned, especially the young folks that weren't around in 2000 to see what happened, to say, now what, right? What are we going to do? Are we going to go and support Trump? No. We don't want Hillary. And that's where Jill Stein, I think, is getting a lot of street cred. And I think that in some ways the Democrats are fearful of that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you break it down generationally like that. I'm working on a piece now which kind of breaks it down as within the lens of baby boomer entitlement. that the baby boomer generation sucked the oxygen out of the room and the resources and everything, and left sort of, you talk to millennials now, and they're left holding the bag. And nobody really represents baby boomer entitlement really like the Clintons. They're the poster children of that, such that they could demand entitlement now to the White House. Not like they offer anything as far as skills that any other qualified American can't provide as leadership. It's not about that at all. I mean, they could wear that as a cloak, but I mean, it's just this absurd entitlement that it's her turn. I don't know what that means. I don't know when it's your turn or my turn, but probably never. But somehow it's her turn, and that seems to work. And similarly, her supporters also seem to be of a generational mindset where they seem to acquiesce to that. That seems to be okay. That's fine. Sure, we're entitled to that. It's a generational thing. And I don't think people have any kind of active conscious thought about that. It's just like, oh yeah, sure, it's not a big deal. To me, it seems I'm a baby boomer, but it's abhorrent to me, and to other of my generational friends, Paul Street and Margaret Kimberly, we're all around the same age, and we don't fall into that sort of classification.
Yeah, well, you're probably exceptions, right? I think the baby boomer generation really are the defenders of the status quo, and Hillary in this case is also right, and she's safe. Yeah. So let's ignore the fact that we have a whole generation of folks that are totally in debt because of student loans. They can't get good jobs. But let's protect the baby boomers, right? So that's that disconnect between voting generations, I think, and that's a reason. And Hillary is capitalizing on that for sure.
Yeah. So when we look at the propaganda, and we try to look at left or liberal news sources compared to what we're calling fake left and actual left, and what does this all mean? And so if we look at some of like the cable news or the network news, MSNBC, NPR, The Guardian, actual news sources, they are clearly out shilling for Hillary. It's like you can look in the opinion page of The Guardian on any given day, and there's a columnist there who I don't need to name, but I mean, she is, it's basically, a stenographer for the Clinton campaign. And all their, their reporting and their leading is all, promoting Hillary. If you look at online magazines, Salon, Huffington Post, Slate, The Nation, we could go on and name all the so-called liberal outlets, Alternate. In fact, I went and took a look at Salon this morning. 2 headlines. One is the Clinton BS Files, the right-wing's long history of obsession with the Clinton sex lives.
Yeah, it's very important.
And then Judicial Watch versus Hillary, the conservative group has a long history of spreading Clinton's lies. Now, this thing about the obsession with Clinton's sex lives, I don't know any other candidate who's sort of accused of the things that Bill Clinton's being accused of. So, I mean, why that gets kind of we can't talk about that. That he's a man, he's got a healthy app, whatever the excuses that are drawn up for him are. But it all gets to be washed away because he's just Bill. We're letting Bill be Bill, and so.
Yeah, I mean, and here we are sitting on the 20-year anniversary of welfare reform.
Sure.
Welfare destruction, right? Which essentially, as everybody knows, Clinton passed, and it has essentially dismantled a whole safety net for millions of people, reverted it to states, and in many states, aside from maybe California, Oregon, New York, and a few others, there is no welfare to be heard of. Yeah. And then, of course, there's a limit on what you can do, and you're forcing single moms to go look for work. These are the issues we should be talking about, right? I mean, if we want to talk about African Americans that are continue to struggle, it dates back to the Clinton neoliberal years, and of course, even before that, and institutional racism and the rest of it. But Hillary's not going to revert that. She's not going to, change course, and she's not going to even adopt even any of the rhetoric of the Sanders campaign when it comes to those issues. So. We're stuck treading water, and here we are with these so-called, liberal media outlets that are essentially propaganda machines for the Democratic right wing, and whether they know it or not. And this isn't to say there aren't good journalists that work there, and The Nation, for example, does have some very good journalists, and I know they don't agree with their editorial slant on certain things. But overall, if you take the whole gamut of what they're publishing, you see where they're going and what they support. And there's some pretty specific examples we could talk about, of course, but.
Yeah, well, if you look at it through this lens of who are they covering and who are they not covering and how are they covering them, it really starts to become clear. And if you want to get to the issue of why do people acquiesce to easily, or Democrats to a Clinton presidency? Well, the propaganda is sort of just what allows it to unfold. That we could actually we're actually ushering in a Clinton 2 regime is it should be shocking to everybody in a democracy that this family could walk right in here again with the acquiescence of when I was trying to look at the numbers of exactly how many people are active supporters of her within the Democratic Party, because registered Democrats are less than 30% now of the voting public, right? Yeah. And you got to figure within that maybe half of them are actively supporting. So, you're looking at numbers maybe around 13-15% of the registered voters are actually supporting what we're going to be left with here because of crazy. If there had been a shoe instead of Donald Trump, we probably would be looking at a president's shoe.
It's one of the reasons why Hillary doesn't even really have to get out there and campaign, right? Because we're watching Donald Trump destruct right in front of us. The only thing that we can talk about is all these email dumps and everything else that's happening with her at this time. But that's not to say things could change with the debates coming up, right? You never know what can come out of those debates, and Hillary is a fantastic debater. Let's give her that. And Donald, though, is a show. So people will be tuning in.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think there's a lot that come. Certainly the new round of emails and more to come, and WikiLeaks, and there could be a lot, and certainly we can turn out with a different result with the President Trump. But that being the case,
but it's hers to lose for sure. Yeah.
It's hers to lose. Yeah, no doubt. There's been another kind of a drama going on within the left media, and this sort of inside baseball a little bit, with the website Truthout,
right?
In particular with John Pilger, who writes for Counterpunch, but also had his piece a few months back edited out at Truthout, and it became a bit of a drama. Can you talk a little bit about what went on there and why that should be sort of complicated or difficult for people to accept?
Sure. Well, Pilger was a long time running stories at Truthout, and just for the record, I've written for Truthout in the past quite a bit on environmental issues mainly. But push come to shove when elections come around, Truthout is pretty staunchly in the Democrats' corner, and Pilger wrote a piece that essentially argued the dangers of a Clinton administration, comparing them to Trump. And his argument was, in a lot of ways, Clinton's far more dangerous, especially when it comes to foreign policy, and giving her history and track record and her rhetoric, of course, and all of these things. Well, a certain paragraph was edited out of his piece, or they were wanting him to edit it out of his piece. And, of course, he wasn't happy with that because it was sort of the crux of his argument. And they had a little blowout, and Counterpunch instead, of course, ran the piece instead. And I think what it illuminates is, here's someone like John Pilger, right, who is probably one of the most famous and popular left voices out there, documentarian, great journalist, is having his pieces not edited for grammatical or syntax errors, right, but for content. And his argument was going to be essentially censored. I think that's very dangerous. Here we are in a time when we shouldn't be censoring any voices. Let's have that argument. I mean, someone may not agree with Pilger's argument, but to not present it, I mean, that's very dangerous. And that, I think, shows the position that Truthout is in, as far as their reluctance to really go after Hillary. I go to their site frequently, and they do, want to open up the debates and allow Jill Stein to come in and those kind of things. And that's safe, because it's not going to happen. It's safe. But they're not going to say why Jill Stein is a better choice, perhaps, than Hillary Clinton. They're not going to touch any of those kind of issues. And I think this is a perfect example of it.
There's also a more recent issue now coming up, and I hate to be beating up on Truthout, but
Hmm.
regarding
That's okay. As long as you're not beating up on Counterpunch, it's fine.
yeah. So when I interviewed John Stauber last week, we talked about this, and he seemed well. He I guess he's part of a group, a listserv called Game Changer,
Yeah.
where he was able to find out and shared publicly with an email that went around because a couple
Hmm.
of weeks ago, maybe like yourself, I started getting comments from friends of mine saying, "Do you know that Jill Stein's a professional candidate? Do you
Yeah.
know Jill Stein is anti-vax? And do you know
Yeah.
Jill Stein is against Wi-Fi? And
Mm.
after you start hearing the same, from three different people on a given day, you start to think, wait a second here. This is,
Yeah.
these aren't curious people digging, and saying, oh, you know what? I was curious to know about Jill Stein's position on vaccines. It comes out and it's sort of vomited out in these what we call fake left media sources, and also in the network news too, because it feeds. They're the
Right.
big beast that's sort of feeding off this as well. And it turns out that this was all sort of perpetrated by an email on this listserv that went out with links to referring articles about these things about Jill Stein being anti-science. Of course, a medical doctor being anti-science. I mean,
Right. Right.
how much more absurd can you get? Now, I've
Yeah.
interviewed Jill Stein, and I know where she stands about not wanting industry corruption of science,
Right.
which totally reasonable. Any reasonable person,
Absolutely. Yeah.
would agree with that. But that you can't even have that nuance in today's environment.
Hmm.
To talk about, particularly when it came to the vaccines. And I asked her about this back in March. Said, it's the third rail, and I'm not even going to ask you to comment because I know it's the third rail. But, if you just say, I question the schedule of the vaccines, or I question, how they're put together, the science, anything, you're labeled now anti-science, anti-vaxxer. And I don't know if you have children, but I mean, I have a grown child, and we came up with those choices, and we made our choice, but we wanted to do the research.
Sure.
What
Yeah.
what responsible parent wouldn't want to do research about
Yeah.
what's happening to your own child? But you
Right.
can't do that anymore because you're labeled, anti-science.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, and Jill Stein was critiquing the industry of science, and the manipulation of science, I think, by corporations. And she was definitely labeled anti-vax by people that are, fearful of the movement that she's sort of gleaning onto. I don't think that she started this movement, but she's definitely a big part of it now and leading it, I think, in many ways. So it was an attempt to discredit her, right?
Yeah.
And a pretty low one at that, because if we're going to have this debate about vaccines and the manipulation of that, by corporations on our science, it should be happening in these places, right? It should be happening with people like Jill Stein talking about it. As someone who's has the voice that she has, a doctor, a retired doctor, but was a doctor for a long time. But instead, right, let's discredit her and say, oh, no, actually Hillary's the right choice because, Jill Stein's position on vaccines is nuanced, which is
or
not.
in the end, it's anti-corporate and anti-establishment, which
That's
is
right.
really what the threat is here. I mean,
Yeah.
because if we're going to talk about this neoliberal, we talk about, at Counterpunch and in my writing, and we throw around neoliberalism like it's cornflakes,
Yeah.
But I still, think, people have no clue as to what this represents. And John Stauber said last week, they might not know what it is, but they know what the effects of it are.
Right. Right.
And which does make a lot of sense. But at the same time, somebody made an argument to me that can you imagine living in the Soviet Union and not knowing what was called communism?
Yeah. Right.
You'd be thinking, am I crazy? What is this sort of, state-dominated system I'm living under? Similarly here, any time that somebody speaks out against the establishment, they're quickly attacked by, media propagandists to say that you're anti this, you're that, and quickly get labeled, or you're a Russian sympathizer.
Mm-hmm.
You're
Right.
you're a Putin lover. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm sure you're not old enough to remember the film The Russians Are Coming, which
Yeah, sure.
okay.
Yeah.
But it's as absurd as that. But I don't know what people expect for the president of Russia to be, supporting U.S. interests in foreign. I mean, his job is he's taking care of Russia's interests. And we could get into all the geopolitics, which is a separate issue. But to expect that he's there to make Americans happy is just a bizarre, concept to begin with. But that Jill was there for a conference. Now it means that she pals around with Putin.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I can definitely have some strong grievances with some of her positions on Syria, for example. But that's a separate issue, right? When we're talking about this Robert Neiman, I believe is his name, who is the president of the board of Truthout, for example, sending out this email that had links to articles that he asked his friends to send around when there were Jill Stein supporters to raise suspicion or questions or whatever, however he phrased it.
Right.
It's pretty dangerous. And this is a guy who has some influence. He's the policy director at Just Foreign Policy, which I don't really know what they do, but they exist. And then this network that John is a part of essentially is, from my understanding at least, a network that is trying to tap into the millennial angst, the Sandernista supporter. So they're directly trying to influence that generation of voters to vote for Hillary Clinton. And that's essentially what he was advocating for. And that is very dangerous, right? I mean, instead of saying, here's the reasons why, again, you should support Hillary Clinton, this is why you shouldn't support Jill Stein, right?
Yeah.
This is what, and is that democracy? I would argue that it's not.
Yeah. It's sort of like saying, if you want a glass of water, have a glass of not milk. I mean, like you say, I keep saying it goes against the laws of physics. If I'm choosing Jill Stein or I'm choosing Donald Trump or I'm choosing Hillary, I'm only responsible for the outcome of my choice.
Right.
But there's no way I could be responsible for the outcome of somebody else's choice. I mean, but that's what the propaganda has brought us. And
then what kind of influence does he have, for example, on the editorial policy at Truthout, which is one of the largest, left-leaning publications in the U.S. And they do publish some fantastic stuff. Yeah. I mean, they have some really, really great stuff. But when push comes to shove, what corner are they in? And elections usually expose those sort of cracks.
Yeah.
And of course, Alternet and a lot of the other ones are even worse. And that's where I think the danger comes in, is that when people think these are the sources of information from the left, and then they go there and it's not, right?
Yeah.
That's the danger, I think, that we're living in. And fortunately, there are places like Counterpunch, and can pat ourselves on the back, I guess, but that do provide a forum for these types of discussions and debates.
Yeah. I mean, it requires a deeper level of discernment on the part of the citizen to find that. Maybe we get into that before we finish up. But just to finish up on this piece on Neiman. So I mean, there's been back and forth now. Emails about going. And you've probably seen them, and I've seen them. And I got this one now finally from that he posted to the Game Changer Salon listserv that I guess John Stauber sent out. Takes a lot of balls, but I mean, he writes in this in his sort of mea culpa here, which is at the time I sent the email, polls were suggesting that Trump could win the presidential election and that the third party vote could easily affect the outcome. At the same time, people who I know personally, leftists, including longtime friends, were telling me that it was fine with them if Trump won, and that was a key reason why they were supporting Jill Stein. So I say name one person, okay? I don't know anybody who fits that description. That's just nonsense. And then, of course, he apologizes for the offense that he's caused, but not for the action that he took. No,
and he's not admitting that he wouldn't do it again if the polls were close, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think what it gets down to is this lack of understanding, and I mean, at the heart of this whole discussion, right, is lesser evil politics, and the failure of progressives to really look at that as an anti-democratic position. To argue to somebody that you shouldn't vote your conscience because of the potential outcome is ridiculous, right? I mean, instead of saying the Democrats aren't providing an alternative, the Democrats have done everything they can to kill these movements inside the party. Let's look at who they actually represent. Let's give people a reason to vote for them, right? But they're not. And if those little sheep, progressive sheep, stray from the pasture, people get pretty scared. And I think that's where, I argued from day one about the Sanders campaign, much to a lot of criticism that I took, that Sanders was essentially going to play this role of corralling people into the Clinton campaign, because I didn't see any chance of him surviving the primaries for a number of reasons. And essentially that's what happened, right? I mean, we saw him come out and hold his nose and tell everybody that they need to get on board the Clinton train. And it's very damaging to social movements. Now the Sanders supporters, fortunately, a lot of them stormed out of the DNC, the convention, and a lot of them now are scratching their heads saying, this isn't what we signed up for. This is a movement. This is about a living wage. This is about, ending debt, student debt. This is about changing our foreign policy in some ways. So if we're not giving those people a place to go, then what we're leaving them with is no alternative. And that's what these guys are actually arguing, is they shouldn't have an alternative, right? They shouldn't have a place to go. They shouldn't have a third party or a green party that challenges this, two-party, one-party system. And so I think it's a dangerous precedent. And I think that these guys are on the front lines of it, and they've infiltrated progressive movements to essentially force progressives into a monopolitic, is what I would call it, a corporate politic that doesn't leave any room for debate or alternatives.
Yeah. Well, one of the leaders in that group, and he's been really effective, is Robert Reich, the former Labor Secretary under Bill Clinton.
Right.
And he is a really influential voice for, this sort of fake left policies where it all sounds great, but it has to, in the end of it, it always ends up with supporting Hillary. There was a really fantastic debate between him and Chris Hedges that Amy Goodman did on Democracy Now! And and Reich kept saying, I agree with everything you're saying, Chris, but can we wait till after the election?
Yeah.
And
that's not exactly how movements work, right? I mean, in fact, it's the opposite. If we can go back to 2000 and look at the anti-globalization movement, and essentially after the election it didn't exist. We can look at the anti-war movement going into 2004 and had to be, Kerry comes on board, and he's holding hands of generals and saying that he's going to outdo Bush in Iraq. After that election, essentially the anti-war movement didn't exist. We can look at 2008 and we can look at the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement essentially was absorbed into the Obama presidency.
Absolutely.
So this, we don't even have to go that far in history to see how social movements essentially die with the Democrats.
Yeah. So then the question, what is a citizen to do? I mean, I have a lot of friends that are, tired of hearing from me, frankly, on social media. How come you couldn't support Bernie? And, like you, I saw through that from day one. I interviewed Jill Stein back last summer. And I said he's a cult of personality candidate. He's a messianic figure for people who want a savior.
Right.
And that seemed really clear to me. And that's not the way to elect a leader. And certainly in a democracy, we don't elect saviors.
Right. I think what people should do is continue to build movements outside of the electoral process. I think that we need to hold everybody's feet to the fire, no matter what party they belong to. And I think that the Green Party is a good vehicle for that in some ways, to build grassroots politics. But I see movements as actually making the most change. And those movements need to stay active no matter what's going on as far as elections are concerned. And if the anti-war movement, for example, existed, I would argue that it doesn't, pretty neutered at the moment, was out protesting Hillary and her drone policies and the other things that she's asking for, like more intervention in Syria, or what she's done in Libya and other places, then we would actually be getting somewhere. And then perhaps the Democrats would start listening. But if they don't feel threatened, if they don't think or feel that they're going to lose votes ever, then they're not going to ever even listen to progressives because they feel like the progressives have nowhere else to go. And I would argue that continue to build movements, continue to stick to your issues, and elections do matter, especially at the local level where things can actually impact people's lives very directly. But on the national scale, stick to the big issues. Let's end poverty. Let's fight global warming. Really fight it. Let's end our unjust foreign policies and our imperialist policies. Those are the big issues, and if we don't address those and stay on point, we get distracted every 4 years.
Right. Well, you mentioned global warming, climate change. That's been totally vacant off the talking points conversation in the presidential debate, except of course for Jill. And we know every month it's hotter and hotter and hotter than the previous month on record. We look at storms. What's going on now in Louisiana. You don't have to even look for evidence anymore. It's like you actually have to look for where's the evidence not happening now to show climate change. And then even the argument that the Syria civil war started as a water resource war. Could have been the first climate change inspired conflict. Where are the movements now? If we could talk about movements outside the process, because clearly the Democratic Party, just like Al Gore is a representative of climate change. Maybe some cap and trade corporate devised system of climate change. But where can people go now who really want to make a difference? Where do millennials go? If not for Sanders, sure, there's, like you say, we have the Stein campaign, but in movements now outside the process, where do people go? Where are the movements happening?
Well, I live in Long Beach, California, and I can say that there's a very vibrant environmental movement here that's fighting local fracking, that's pushing the city council to adopt better policies around oil production in the city. And there's neighbors now everywhere that are putting up solar panels. Obviously this is on one issue, but promoting community gardens. Those are eating locally, supporting farmers markets. These are very real things that impact people's lives very directly and change a community. And when you see more farmers markets popping up, that means that the Walmarts of the world are selling less products. And when you start supporting local, you see benefits of that. Unfortunately, California has produce year-round, even with this drought. But I think everybody, no matter what community they live in, can get involved in issues that affect them, and that's how you can see real change happen and in very direct ways.
Right. So really it's going to happen more at the local level now. It seems like, I was involved with the anti-war and, the bigger campaigns you talked about, and they seem to fizzle out. It's amazing how quickly they fizzle out. But the real change is happening at the local level. It seems like that's the only place where we can start to, make things happen.
Well, and that's where the conversation starts, right? That's where you're out front and you talk to your neighbor about something and they listen. Because, politics and the electoral politics and the elections can be very divisive. But when you sit down and you talk to people, I have a lot of friends that are Republicans. I grew up in Montana. And I would say I have a lot in common with them and a lot of things when we sit down and actually talk about stuff. They don't like Hillary or Trump. And we agree on that. And then when we start talking about the reasons, we realize that there's a lot of overlap there. They don't support an egregious militarist foreign policy. They don't support this corporate agenda in many ways. Montana might be special. It's a little libertarian in some ways, but I think that when these conversations start at the local level, these issues get going at the local level. That's where change happens, and it always has.
Great. Well, this has been great. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for the work you do at Counterpunch, and hopefully we can get more people coming there and getting some real unfiltered information about how to move forward and choices that they make. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
You bet. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.